Maya's palm skated across the dormant console, her fingertips reading the carved alien glyphs the way another woman might read Braille. 4 of the symbols she recognized from the initial survey logs. A fifth made no sense at all. Her fingers stopped, reversed, tapped once. The control room air tasted of burnt insulation and stale coolant, a chemical tang that clung to the back of the throat. Backup lights pulsed in a faltering amber rhythm. Every third beat, the shadows along the far wall stretched a fraction longer before snapping back. She identified the void beacon symbol buried among the glyphs, a spiral that folded inward on itself 3 times, cut so deep into the metal that her thumb caught in the groove. Her other hand was already drumming, knuckles rapping the console edge. Fast, then faster. Eris, the security specialist, answered from the outer ring corridor, their voice crackling through Maya's earpiece. "I'm at the sensor node. Tell me you found something worth the walk." "I found the beacon." Maya straightened, though no one could see her. Her fingers kept drumming. "Good." A pause. "Bad timing. A Morthari patrol altered course 11 minutes ago. I make it 3 hours out, closing fast." Across the control room, Ossian rotated inside his water-filled encounter suit. The liquid caught the amber light and scattered it across his iridescent scales. His translator rendered his voice in careful, melodic cadence. "You called it a beacon. That is not what the glyph reads." Maya turned, then translated. Ossian's suit hummed as it adjusted internal pressure. His scales shifted from silver to a troubled deep blue. "The nearest equivalent in your language is void collar. My people's oldest records describe it as a door. The records are very clear." Another pause, longer. "It is a door that should not be opened." The word door landed cold in Maya's chest. She looked back at the console. The spiral glyph seemed to twist under the flickering light. Her crew had come to this derelict station on the edge of former human space because the initial deep-range scan had flagged something powerful and old. Humanity was barely 2 decades into its return to galactic affairs. Every alien species they had encountered so far treated them like a ghost story that had inconveniently come true. The Morthari were worse. The Morthari had never believed humanity was dead in the first place, and they had spent 2 centuries treating our abandoned border stations as target practice. Ossian's suit gurgled softly. "Maia Kade, you are considering activating it." "I'm considering understanding it." She met his gaze through the curved faceplate. "There's a difference. Not to a door." She made the decision the way she had made every decision since the expedition began. Fast, because delay was just another kind of failure, and pressed her palm flat against the activation plate she had identified 4 minutes earlier. Low power only. A diagnostic trickle? Nothing more. The console remained dark. A new glyph surfaced on the plate to her left, pulsing with a faint violet light. She did not recognize it. She did not recognize the 2 that followed it either, or the sequence that began scrolling across the plate in a script that seemed to fold inward on itself, repeating the same spiral pattern she had traced with her thumb. "Eris," she said, and her voice came out tighter than she intended. "I need you back here. On my way." A grunt. The sound of boots on corroded deck plating. "What happened?" "Nothing yet." The glyphs refused to resolve. She cycled through 3 translation matrices, and each one returned a null result or a string of contradictions. The symbols were not a language. They were instructions, and the instructions were written for a mind, not a machine. Her hand moved before she let herself second-guess. The psionic interface rested inside its padded case at her hip. She unsealed it. The woven filaments felt like cool water spreading across her scalp the moment she raised it to her head. The sensation was not unpleasant. That was the dangerous part. Ossian's translator crackled. "Maya." She pulled the interface down. Cold flooded her skull. Not a temperature, a presence. The control room vanished, and she was somewhere else. Somewhere that was not a place. And the absence of light around her was not darkness. Darkness was the absence of something. This was the presence of an absence. A hunger that had been waiting so long it had forgotten what it was waiting for. Only that it was patient. Only that it would know when the door opened. Images that were not images. The spiral. The spiral folding inward. The spiral folding inward a 3rd time, and something vast shifting on the other side of a membrane she could feel but not name. She tore the interface away. The control room slammed back into focus. She was on her knees and did not remember falling. Eris was shouting through the earpiece, their voice a distant tinny noise, and Ossian had retreated to the far wall inside his suit, his scales flaring a color she had never seen on a Tide song before. Copper bright, the color of alarm broadcast across a species that rarely alarmed. Then the beacon woke. The subsonic thrum hit before the sound, a vibration that started in the deck plating and climbed through her boots, her shins, her spine. It found her sternum and settled there like a second heartbeat. The console erupted with light, violet and cold and folding inward in a spiral that matched the glyph exactly. A sound followed, so low it was almost beneath hearing. The deck plates trembled. A tool skittered off a nearby workstation and clattered across the floor. Maia stayed on her knees and watched the spiral turn. She knew, and the knowing arrived fully formed, alien and certain, that the action could not be undone. The door was not open. Not yet, but it was unlocked. And on the other side, something vast and patient had just turned its attention toward them. The weight of it pressed down. 200 years of isolation. The legacy of a humanity that had once been feared and was now a rumor. She had come here to prove the return was not a mistake. Instead, she had reached through the dark and shaken hands with a waiting catastrophe. Her shadow stretched long across the deck, cast by the violet spiral light. She watched it and thought of ghosts. Ossian's translator crackled. They heard it too. His voice had lost its melodic cadence. He sounded raw, stripped of diplomacy. The Morthari are not patrolling any longer. They are coming straight for the beacon. The spiral kept turning. The thrum kept beating in her chest. Somewhere beyond the station's hull, beyond the cold vacuum, beyond a dimensional membrane that had just grown thin, the answering presence faded. It left no signal, no trace, only the certainty. Something now knew humanity was back. The tactical display burned cold violet, and Kethis Vex watched the ancient beacon's signal blaze across it like a wound reopening. The Revenant's vow hung in the void, its bone-white hull bleeding the last heat of the drop from void space. On the bridge, the air carried the smell of dry bone and cold incense, a blend every Morthari warlord inhaled from childhood as the perfume of dominion. Pale phosphor strips lined the command tiers, barely pushing back the dark, and the undead crew stood motionless at their stations. Hollow-eyed soldiers, whose chest cavities had been packed with preservation salts, and whose grafted bone blades clicked softly when the ship's gravitics shifted. Sirik hunched at the sensor pit, his mottled skin glistening with the thin sheen of nervous excretion. He wrung his hands. Twice. 3 times. Warlord. Confirmed. A single human vessel. Small. A scout or a courier. Moored to the station's ventral spur. Kethis tapped one long finger against his chest plate. The click of bone on bone echoed through the quiet. Ghosts. The word pleased him. He let it hang. They were supposed to be dead, Sirik ventured. The records decay. Species collapse. Scavengers crawl out of the wreckage wearing their ancestors' ships and pretend irrelevance. Kethis's fingers stopped mid-tap. These are not the humans who once made the galaxy flinch. These are scraps. Awful. Ghosts playing with fire they cannot understand. He turned from the display. The subvocal chant of the bridge crew pulsed at the edge of hearing. A war hymn pitched too low to catch with the ear, but impossible to miss with the skin. It prickled. It itched. It set the bone blades of the crew vibrating in sympathetic rhythm. Attack formation, Kethis said. Sirik's hands clenched. Warlord, the beacon's resonance. The frequency. It matches the oldest hymns, the Deathkin texts, the ones that speak of, I know what they speak of. Kethis's voice cut flat and cold. The phosphor strips flickered once, a trick of the ship's ancient power grid. And for a heartbeat, the warlord's face was all shadow and pale gray-blue angles. They speak of warnings written by frightened ancestors who thought the void had teeth, he continued. I am not my ancestors. I am not frightened, and I will not let a ghost story keep me from the weapon that unites the dominions. He tapped his chest plate again. Once. Hard. Attack formation. Now. The fleet dropped from void space in a flicker of cold light. 6 warships. 48 boarding pods. Each pod carried a dozen undead soldiers with grafted bone blades, their empty eye sockets packed with targeting salts that glowed faint green in the dark. The pods streaked toward the station like flung needles, silent and precise. Kethis watched from the Revenant's vow, his arms folded, his ceremonial armor creaking as he breathed. The subvocal chant rose in intensity until his teeth ached with it. Then the station answered. A crude energy field flickered around the beacon, a blue-white shell of disrupted particles that snapped and spat where it touched vacuum. It was ugly, asymmetrical, patched together from whatever power sources the station still possessed. Kethis had seen better shielding on a third Dominion scrap hauler, but it was there, and the humans had erected it in the space of minutes. They did not flee, Cyric whispered. Kethis said nothing. His finger had stopped tapping. The first wave of boarding pods hit the field and died. Bone blades shattered. Preservation salts scattered into vacuum in brief green puffs. The pods crumpled, their hulls peeling back like dead skin, and the soldiers inside, already dead, already silent, came apart in pieces that spun away into the dark. No scream, no panic. The undead did not feel loss, but Kethis felt it for them, a cold pressure building behind his sternum. He leaned forward. Shift to assimilation pattern, he said. The tactical officer, a corpse with facial plating that hid whatever species it had once been, obeyed without hesitation. The remaining pods altered course, spreading wide, seeking gaps in the flickering field. Assimilation pattern. Overwhelm, absorb, repurpose. Find the weakness and pour through it until the enemy's strength becomes your own. Standard Morthari doctrine. Perfected 4,000 years ago. Never improved because it had never needed improvement. That was the way of the Deathkin. Mastery was a peak. Once reached, it did not change. The human field held. 17 pods breached. 12 more died. The field flickered, dipped, nearly collapsed, and then stabilized in a new configuration, a different frequency pattern, as if someone inside the station had learned from the first assault and revised their defenses in real time. Kethis's jaw tightened. Again, he said. 3 more waves. 3 more failures. The station's field adapted each time, shifting phase states and absorption patterns faster than the pods could find purchase. The undead soldiers clawed at it with bone blades that had never failed to cut anything, and found nothing solid enough to cut. Cyric's hand shook. Warlord, the humans are still there. They are still working. The beacon's power draw is increasing. Kethis watched the tactical display. The tiny human ship still clung to the station's ventral spur, still active, still broadcasting a steady transponder ping that any species in the sector could hear. They were not running. They were not hiding. They were holding ground. Ghosts should scatter. Ghosts should break. That was what ghosts did. What every species did when the Morthari came calling. The living fled. The dead served. That was the order of things, the unbroken chain of consequence that had held for 40 centuries. Something pricked at him. A thought he did not want. He crushed it. Ghosts are ghosts. He repeated it to himself, a subvocal counterpoint to the war hymn still thrumming through the deck. Warlord, I said again. The field is adapting faster than ours, I said again. Kethis's finger came down on Cyric's shoulder, and the smaller Morthari flinched, his mottled skin darkening with fresh excretion. The warlord's grip was not gentle. Send the next wave, then the next. I do not care how many pods we spend. The dead are not a finite resource. We have entire worlds whose populations now serve in bone and salt. Empty them. Strip them. I want that beacon. Cyric nodded, a jerky motion, and relayed the command. The 4th wave launched. The 5th readied, and then Cyric made a sound, a thin, high noise that cut through the subvocal chant like a blade through preserved flesh. He pointed at the display with a hand that trembled so badly his finger blurred. Warlord, The beacon's signal is changing. Kethis turned. It is no longer just transmitting, Syrinx said. His voice cracked on the last word. It is receiving something. The display showed it clearly. The beacon's signal, which had blazed outward in a steady violet spiral since the moment the humans activated it, had shifted. The spiral was reversing, contracting, folding inward. And beneath it, below the station, below the human field and the Morthari fleet, and the cold dark between stars, something answered. Not a signal, not a pulse, a presence. Receiving from where? Kethis asked, though he already knew. Syric's mouth worked. Below the void, beneath the dimensional membrane. Warlord, something down there has heard us. Something is looking back. Kethis froze. His finger stopped mid-tap, suspended an inch above his chest plate. The subvocal chant of the undead crew faltered for the first time since the Revenant's vow had left Drydock. Even the corpses felt it. A pressure, a weight, a regard that came from no direction and every direction at once. The phosphor strips dimmed. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the beacon's signal changed again, and something in the void began to move. Maia's fingers moved before conscious thought caught up. Both hands on separate panels, drumming override sequences into the beacon's command layers. The crystal spire hummed against her sternum, a frequency that made her molars ache. Sweat traced cold lines down her temples. The monitors cast hollow blue shadows across every face in the room. She tore through access barriers. Not elegant work, fast work. Authentication prompts and alien syntax that should have required weeks of study collapsed under patterns she was learning as she broke them. Her left hand corrected her right hand's mistakes. The mistakes taught her where the rules bent. Within 90 seconds, the beacon's operating logic lay exposed across 3 screens like a dissected animal. This isn't a relay, she said. Her voice came out flat, factual, the way a surgeon might note unexpected anatomy. Eris looked up from the mining laser, knuckles flexing one by one. Explain. The signal architecture. A relay amplifies and repeats. This structure loops inward. Every layer feeds back to the center. She highlighted a spiral of nested commands, each one wrapping tighter around a core that the system refused to display. It's a lock. Someone built this to keep something shut. Ossian's encounter suit glided closer, water swirling through its chest cavity in agitated silver currents. His translator rendered his voice in that calm, measured cadence that now felt obscene in the heat and noise. The glyphs around the core. I have finished the translation. Maia did not look away from the screens. Tell me. It is a prison. Something is sealed inside a pocket dimension, and the beacon is the door. A pause. The water in his suit shifted toward deep blue. The ancients did not build it to communicate. They built it to bury. The hull screamed. Not a metaphor. Metal shrieked against metal, a sound that traveled through the station's bones and into Maia's jaw. The vibration rattled loose tools off a console. Somewhere 2 compartments aft, atmosphere bled through a breach before emergency fields snapped shut. Eris was already moving. The mining laser they had torn from Storage Bay 4 now sat mounted on a gimbal brace, its power conduit spliced into the station's reactor bus. They had done it in 3 minutes and 12 seconds. Maia had heard them counting under their breath, a habit from old combat drills. 14 seconds to strip the safety governors, 31 to reroute the cooling loop, the rest to stabilize the beam emitter so it would not melt after 2 firings. Second wave, Eris called. Their scar pulled white against their jaw. Hull breach on deck 3, multiple contacts. Maia pulled up the internal feeds. The undead soldiers moved wrong. Not slow, not clumsy, but wrong. Jerky precision that started and stopped with no acceleration curve. Bone blades grafted to forearms, ribs exposed through armor that had fused with the flesh beneath. They did not bleed. They did not pause to assess. They advanced. The laser fired. The sound was not a beam. Beams had no sound in vacuum, and these corridors still held air. What Maia heard was the screech of superheated metal and the wet crack of something that had once been biological. 2 soldiers dropped, their torsos opened diagonally. The others adjusted. Maia watched it happen on the monitors. The bone density of the surviving soldiers shifted. She could see it in the way the emergency lights reflected off their carapaces, a subtle change in texture and color. Within seconds, the laser's next shot scored a hit, but did not penetrate. The beam scattered across a surface that had remodeled itself to resist thermal cutting. They learn, Eris muttered, lining up another shot. No. Maya's fingers stopped drumming. She stared at the tactical overlay, at the way the Morthari forces moved through the corridors. 3 attack formations. Always 3. She had seen the first wave use them, then the second. Now the third, breaching a different section, came through in the same 3 patterns with variations so small she needed the computer to confirm they existed. Not learning. Refinement. Centuries of refinement. The Morthari had perfected their undead soldiers. Every possible tactical scenario had been solved. The solution practiced until it lived in the bone itself. They did not adapt because adaptation meant imperfection. They improved within a frame they never changed. Maya's hand found the comm panel. Eris, the bone resonance frequency you pulled from their chatter earlier. You still have it? Buried in the noise logs. Why? Tune the laser to match it. Eris did not ask for explanation. Their hands moved across the emitter's control interface, dialing the beam's coherence pattern toward the frequency Maya fed them. The numbers scrolled. The beam's color shifted from white-hot to a deep violet that made the shadows in the room jump and twist. The third wave came through the breach on Deck 4. 12 undead soldiers in the standard 3-point assault pattern, bone blades gleaming with the preservative oils that kept their edge. They moved in perfect synchronization, covering each approach vector with a precision that would have overwhelmed any static defense. Eris fired. The beam hit the lead soldier square in the chest, and the bone shattered. Not burned, not cut. It came apart like glass struck at its resonant frequency, fracturing outward in a spiral that caught the soldiers behind it. Preservative salts scattered into the corridor air, glittering in the beam's violet glow. The assault pattern collapsed before the second rank could adjust. 10 seconds. 12 contacts neutralized. The ship fell quiet. Maya exhaled. Her fingers ached. She had not noticed herself gripping the console edge until the tension released and blood returned to her knuckles. The monitors showed drifting particulate where the undead soldiers had been, nothing more. The realization landed like a physical blow. The Morthari were not slow. They were not incompetent. They were masters of a doctrine that did not permit fundamental change. Species that reached peak capability and refined it, generation after generation, until every motion was perfect and every tactic flawless. They had spent millennia polishing the same 3 attack formations into art. Humans changed the frame. A screen updated with a new heat plume, a 4th wave assembling in the Morthari ship's holding position. Kethis Vex was hesitating. The warlord had just watched his perfected assault collapse in 10 seconds, and he did not understand why. He could not understand why. The explanation required a cognitive posture his species had abandoned before humanity's ancestors crawled from the ocean. Maya felt something sharp and warm rise in her chest. Not triumph, not relief. Pride, fierce and quiet, the kind that asked nothing of anyone else. Humanity's return was not a restoration of old power. It was the arrival of a mind that treated every failure as raw material. The lock is weakening. Ossian's voice cut through the silence. His translator maintained its melodic calm, but the water in his suit had turned the color of a trench where no light reached. Maya turned. The beacon's core stood behind her, crystalline and warm. A hairline fracture had formed along its primary facet, not a crack of broken material, but a crack of light. Dark light. Light that pulled at her vision the way a vacuum pulled at loose atmosphere. The Morthari's Deathkin energy, Ossian continued. The soldiers you destroyed, their essence is not dispersing. It is being drawn into the pocket dimension. It is feeding the entity inside. The crack widened by a fraction of a millimeter. They are waking what they were taught to fear. Maya looked at the dark light spreading through the crystal and felt something vast and patient stir on the other side of the membrane. Something that had been waiting a very long time for the door to weaken. Ossian's webbed fingers moved across the console with the fluid precision of a current finding its channel. The alcove hummed around him, the reactor's massive housing a curved wall of warm alloy at his back. his encounter suit's oxygenation system bubbling a steady counterpoint to the distant thunder of hull breaches. He routed power from 3 non-critical junctions, piggybacked the signal through the beacon's own diagnostic array, and opened the channel. Kethis Vex appeared on the display in a wash of cold incense haze. His ceremonial bone plate armor caught the bridge lights of the Revenant's vow, and his pale gray-blue face was set in the frozen calm of a predator who had never been forced to reconsider a kill. "You are not the human," Kethis observed. His voice emerged from the console speaker with a faint undertone of distortion, as if the signal itself resented carrying it. "I am Ossian of Tidesong, emissary to the Council of Shifting Waters. I speak now for no faction, but for the physics that govern us all." A pause. Kethis tapped one long finger against his chestplate. The rhythm was slow, patient. A warlord measuring the weight of a new variable and finding it wanting. "Speak quickly, Waterkin. The ghosts have nothing I wish to hear, and you shield them." Ossian felt the vibrations of a distant explosion roll through the station's superstructure. The water inside his suit rippled, a spectral shimmer of deep blue passing through it before he stilled it with a conscious effort. His scales settled back to silver. "The beacon is not a weapon, Warlord. It is a cage. What your ancestors called the Void Devourer is real, and it is sealed inside." Kethis's expression did not shift. "A human trick. They want the weapon for themselves. You are their mouthpiece. I am sending you archival data from the Tidesong Deep Repository. Records older than your dominion. Older than your undead technology. The ancients who built the beacon did not seek power. They sought to contain something that feeds on the energy between life and death." Ossian's fingers found the transmit command. The data packet pulsed away, layered with a subsonic harmonic that he had threaded into the translation, a melodic insistence his species used only in moments of absolute conviction. It was the closest a Tidesong ever came to begging. The channel went quiet. The bubbling of his suit's oxygen filled the silence. Maia's voice cut in on a private comm, tight and frayed at the edges. "Ossian, I've finished the decay signature analysis. The resonance pattern is unmistakable." Her breathing was too fast. He heard it clearly, the shallow rhythm of a creature pushed past its endurance. A pause, then she continued. "The entity inside the beacon emits a frequency that exactly matches the Morthari reanimation signature. Not similar, identical. Their undead troops are walking batteries, and that thing outside, it's been draining them the whole time. If the beacon fails, it won't drift into empty space. It will feed. The Morthari fleet is the densest concentration of its preferred energy in the system. It will consume them first." Ossian's gill slits fluttered inside his helmet, a physiological response his translator rendered as a soft chime. He did not allow the noise to carry into the open channel. A new silence from Kethis. One breath. Two. Ossian watched the warlord's face, searching for the micro-expressions that translated across every species. Pupil dilation, mandible tension, the slight flex of a jaw muscle. He found something unexpected. Not fear. The Morthari had excised that response from their command cast centuries ago, but a deeper thing. A memory. Ancient. Unwelcome. The breath ended. "Surrender the beacon," Kethis said. "The physics of the threat are irrelevant. The demand stands." Ossian let the words hang in the water between them. He did not answer immediately. His fingers drifted to the secondary console, calling up the beacon's external visual feeds without conscious decision. The movement felt almost traitorous, a diplomat's reflex to find the right argument, the ideal phrasing, the perfect leverage. But there was no argument. Kethis Vex was not reasoning. He was executing a doctrine that had never permitted revision. A goal set could not be unset. A warlord who turned back from an objective did not remain a warlord. The Morthari dominions were built on this immutability, and their ships were powered by the perfected dead. Static mastery. Ossian understood it now, fully and coldly. The humans had grasped it in their third chapter aboard this station, had weaponized it within minutes of observing the undead soldiers' attack patterns. They learned, they revised, they iterated. The Morthari had no such mechanism. They could not learn from failure because failure, by definition, could not exist. Every outcome was a refinement of the original perfect vision. If the beacon was not a weapon, it must become one. If the entity was a threat, it must be claimed and dominated. There was not a single verb in the Morthari command lexicon for retreat. A diplomat's desperation was a thing the Tide Song modulated away as a matter of biological discipline. It served no purpose. It clouded judgment. Ossian had felt its chemical precursor exactly 3 times in his adult life, a sharp, cold surge through his circulatory web that his training smoothed back into calm within seconds. He did not smooth it back this time. He let it stay. He let it sharpen him. "I cannot argue you out of your nature, warlord," Ossian said, and his melodic cadence flattened into something almost human. "So I will show you." He rerouted the beacon's visual feed. The console accepted his override codes without resistance. The station's systems were ancient, but they recognized the harmonic signature of a Tide Song's diplomatic clearance as kin to the builder's own protocols. The exterior cameras came alive in full spectral resolution. He hurled the image directly to the Revenant's Vow's bridge display. No warning, no protocol. A raw data forcing that would, in any other context, constitute an act of aggression. The feed resolved. The void outside the station was no longer empty. A massive shadow moved against the starfield. It was not a ship. It was not a cloud of debris. It was a shape that phased between one dimension and another, its edges folding and unfolding in geometries that hurt to track. The cold, distant light of the system's primary bent around it in spirals, as if space itself was curving to accommodate its presence. It had no solid form, yet the cameras caught the outline of something vast and shifting, a suggestion of limbs or tendrils or mouths that existed in superposition, waiting to collapse into a single, terrible configuration the moment the beacon's door swung wide. The entity was hungry. Ossian felt it through the feed in a way that had nothing to do with the visual data. The beacon's signal had been rising in pitch for the last several minutes, a thin wail building at the edge of hearing. He had not consciously tracked it. His body had. His scales were deep blue now, almost black, and the water inside his suit was swirling with a current his conscious mind had not commanded. The undead Morthari soldiers aboard the station stopped mid-stride. Every one of them. Across every breached deck. The soldiers who had been advancing on Eris's position. The soldiers who had been tearing through bulkheads with grafted bone blades. The soldiers who had been adapting their formations with centuries of perfected, unchanging precision. All of them stopped and turned. As one, they faced the beacon chamber. On the display, the shadow in the void opened something that might have been an eye. Kethis Vex did not speak. The silence on the channel stretched into a 5th second, a 6th. Ossian watched the warlord's finger stop tapping. The hand lay flat against the chest plate now, motionless. The feed flickered, and the shadow grew larger. Something was speaking from inside the beacon, not in words, in frequencies that the Morthari reanimation protocols understood at the level of their foundational code. A call, a summons, an ancient hunger that had been waiting 200,000 years for its jailer's heirs to bring it the one thing it needed to finish the door. An army of the perfect dead, radiating exactly the energy it craved. "Warlord," Ossian said softly, "your soldiers are no longer yours." The channel remained open. No one closed it. The shadow pressed against the membrane between dimensions, and the station's hull began to resonate in harmony with the beacon's rising scream. The bridge of the Revenant's Vow screamed. Alarms clawed through every deck, a rising howl that climbed through bone-armored corridors and into the marrow of the crew. The view screens no longer showed tactical overlays. They filled with something that hurt to witness, a writhing darkness that bent the light around it, folding starlight into angles that normal space should not permit. Siric's hands were shaking so badly he could not close his claws around the console. "Warlord, the third wave. They have turned. They are climbing back toward the hull." Kethis did not answer. He stood at the command dais, one long finger tapping his chest plate, tapping faster. The rhythm had escaped his control. On the main display, 24 undead Morthari soldiers crawled across the station's outer plating, bone-grafted limbs moving with a new purpose. They were not running. They were not fighting. They were oriented toward the Revenant's Vow. and their dead faces held an expression Kethis had never seen on reanimated flesh before. Recognition. Override formation pattern, Kethis barked. Command sequence, Vex Prime. All undead units, terminate advance and return to pod dispersal. The console flickered. The soldiers kept coming. Warlord, the reanimation signal. Something is overriding it. Siric's voice cracked, climbing into a whine. The resonance signature does not match our broadcast. It is coming from the entity. It is speaking to them through their own bone graphs. We must retreat. We must. Kethis silenced him with a single gesture, a flat palm cutting through the air. Siric's mouth snapped shut, his mottled skin glistening with fresh nervous excretions. We do not retreat, Kethis said. His voice was steady. It did not shake. That was important. The void torpedo will end this. Morthari mastery is perfect. He turned to the weapons station, where the launch sequence already glowed amber. The void torpedo sat ready in its bone-charred cradle, a sleek black sliver etched with the conquest songs of 17 dead worlds. Cold to the touch, it hummed faintly. It had never failed. It could not fail. The doctrine was absolute. Maia's voice cut through the bridge speakers. She sounded nothing like a ghost. She sounded like someone who had already calculated the next 12 seconds and found them wanting. Kethis, do not fire. The void torpedo phases across dimensional boundaries for detonation, and the targeting solution requires a predictive lock. You cannot predict where that thing will be because it does not occupy a single phase state. You will miss. I do not take tactical instruction from a human. Then take it from physics. The torpedo's success rate against multi-phase targets is already low. Against a partially manifested entity that does not fully exist in normal space, it drops to something close to zero. Close to zero is not zero. Siric was weeping now, a thin, keening sound that Kethis chose not to hear. The bridge crew had recoiled from their stations, pressing their backs against the splintering bone walls. The tendrils had reached the outer hull. The sound of rending metal traveled through the ship like a low, grinding scream, and the smell of ozone bled through the ventilation systems, cold and sharp. Kethis slammed the launch control. The void torpedo left its cradle in a streak of black light, phasing through the Revenant's Vow's outer plating without resistance. It crossed the distance to the entity in half a heartbeat. The targeting solution had been perfect. Kethis had seen it lock. Every variable had been accounted for. The torpedo passed through the edge of the writhing darkness and detonated in empty space. The entity did not recoil. It did not pause. A ripple moved through its shifting mass, something that might have been amusement, and the tendrils tightened against the ship's hull. Bone walls cracked. Somewhere, 3 decks down, a support strut failed with a shriek that echoed through every compartment. Warlord. Siric's voice was barely a whisper. It did not work. Kethis stared at the view screen. His chest felt cold. The tapping finger had stopped. Maia Kade. Her voice came back immediately. No hesitation. No gloating. She had been waiting for him to say her name, and that waiting was the worst part, because it meant she had already known. I am here. You said close to zero. His throat was tight around the words. You knew it would fail. I knew. You needed to know too. Now you do. Listen to me. The tendrils punched through the hull on deck 2. An atmosphere alarm joined the howling. The smell of ozone intensified, mixing with something older, something like cold stone and dead air. The entity was tasting the ship, tasting the life force inside it, and finding it exactly what it wanted. Maia spoke fast but calm, her words clipped and precise. She was not asking. She was explaining, and the explanation itself was a demand. The void torpedo is built to phase and detonate. It already has the phase shift capability we need. If I can feed the beacon's lock sequence into the torpedo's flight controller, I can use it not as a weapon, but as a delivery system. The torpedo phases into the entity's dimensional fold, carries the lock sequence directly inside it, and triggers the beacon's sealing pulse from within. Ossian's voice joined hers, the Tidesong emissary's melodic cadence running under Maia's rapid speech like water under stone. The beacon's lock was designed to seal the entity from the outside, but it was never designed to penetrate the dimensional fold. The torpedo can reach what the beacon cannot touch. It is a key that can be turned from inside the door. Kethis heard the plan. He heard all of it. And he understood, with a clarity that cut through the howling alarms and the cracking bone and the cold spreading through his chest, exactly what it would cost. The last void torpedo was mounted in the Revenant's Vow's forward cradle. To hand it to Maia meant yielding firing control to a human, a ghost, a creature his species had dismissed as extinct and therefore beneath consideration. The doctrine of the Morthari was absolute. Power was self-sufficient, or it was not power at all. A warlord who needed an outsider to aim his own weapon was no warlord. The entity's tendrils reached the main reactor conduit. The bridge lights flickered. Cyric screamed. Kethis opened his mouth. The order left his throat like a tearing sound. Something physical. Something that hurt to expel. Human. Take the torpedo. He pressed the transfer control. The firing authority left his console and appeared on hers, 3 seconds of light speed delay away, and in those 3 seconds, he felt something crack open inside him. It was not fear. It was worse. It was the sound of a foundation giving way, the splintering of a certainty that had held him upright through 30 years of conquest and command. Morthari mastery was perfect. Morthari doctrine did not change. But he had just handed his last weapon to a ghost, and his ship was dying around him, and the doctrine had nothing left to say. Maia's voice came back, distant now, focused on something else. I have the torpedo's flight path, but the quantum mind is flickering. It keeps collapsing every time I look at the solution. I have to do this blind. The line held. Kethis stared at the view screen. The tendrils were pulling the hull apart, peeling bone, plating back in long, slow strips. The entity's darkness filled every display, a shifting mass that had never known defeat because it had never faced anything that could learn faster than it could devour. It was ancient. It was perfect. It was exactly like the Morthari had always believed themselves to be. Cyric had stopped weeping. He was staring at Kethis with an expression the warlord did not recognize, and that was somehow the worst thing yet, because Kethis could not tell if it was hope or the death of it. She is human, Cyric whispered. What humans do? Kethis did not answer. He waited. The line was silent. Somewhere, in a station that should have been a tomb, a woman he had tried to kill was looking at a cube full of impossible answers and refusing to blink. He waited. The beacon's glare turned the chamber into a furnace of white light. Maia's hands moved before she told them to. The psionic interface settled across her scalp like cold water, and she pressed the quantum mind cube into the console's auxiliary port before anyone could argue. The dual input hit her skull as a pressure drop, sudden, vertiginous, wrong. Every possible outcome opened at once. She saw the entity breach the station in 42 branching sequences. She saw Eris die 17 ways, Ossian 12 herself more times than she could count. She saw the torpedo miss. She saw it strike true and fail to detonate. She saw the beacon overload and crack the station in half. The crystal storm of futures screamed through her awareness, and behind it all, something vast and hungry noticed her noticing. Eris shouted from the corridor. Maia, it's through the outer seal. Movement scraped inside the walls. Not ratcheting metal. Flesh on alloy. Wet and deliberate. She blocked it out. The quantum cube flickered. She reached for the cleanest solution. A simple firing arc, timed to the entity's next phase emergence. And the moment her attention landed on it, the superposition collapsed. The cube went dark. A failed state. She had observed it with expectation, not acceptance. That killed it. A reset. She pulled her mind back. The interface filaments cooled, and the cube's internal light stuttered, then steadied, rebuilding the probability lattice. She re-engaged faster this time. Her fingers drummed the console edge once, twice, then stilled. Stop thinking like an engineer. The Morthari had spent centuries perfecting the void torpedo. Their doctrine treated it as a weapon to be aimed, a problem of angles and phase predictions stacked like bricks in a wall. Kethis had fired with flawless technique and missed because the entity did not occupy a single phase state long enough for prediction to matter. But Maia had felt it through the psionic link. The entity did not jump between states randomly. It moved with rhythm. A predator's rhythm. Patient, recursive, folding back on itself in patterns too alien for a firing computer to parse. The torpedo did not need to strike a target. It needed to meet a partner. She stopped calculating. She started matching. Her hands dropped to the firing controls, but her attention stayed inside the link. She felt the entity's current phase as a pressure against her sternum, a low vibration like a second heartbeat. She let the torpedo's phase shift frequency drift until it resonated with the beacon's lock signal, not the entity's position, but the door it had been forced through once before. The quantum cube steadied. The branching futures collapsed not into one path, but into a single converging point. The torpedo would not chase the entity. It would arrive exactly where the entity was about to be, because the entity's rhythm was now hers to anticipate. She fired without looking. The launch tube's discharge rattled the deck plates. Through the psionic link, she tracked the torpedo as a needle of cold intent slicing through normal space, then phasing, and the entity's mass registered it late. Too late. The torpedo entered. The beacon screamed. Not sound. Pressure. A dimensional wrench that popped her ears and flattened the air in her lungs. The white-hot spire flared to blinding, and then the lock sequence grabbed hold of the creature and dragged. She felt it through the interface as a tearing of fabric, not cloth, but the membrane between realities, and the entity's presence collapsed inward, folding, 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 until the door slammed shut behind it with a sound like dry wind vanishing into a sealed tomb. The station fell silent, the heavy, wrong silence after too much noise. Maya's ears rang. The smell of singed hair and heated stone filled her nose. She tasted copper. Somewhere behind her, a metal strut ticked as it cooled, a faint rhythm like a clock winding down. The beacon's glow dropped to a steady amber pulse. Standby. Her fingers had stopped moving. She sagged against the console. Her knees held, but only just. The psionic interface was still on her head, and she lacked the strength to remove it. She breathed. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. She had not mastered the system. She had let it teach her while she failed 7 times inside the span of 3 seconds, and each failure had carved a new groove in her understanding. And on the 8th attempt, she had succeeded not because she was smarter, but because her species had never learned to stop after the first success, or the 5th, or the 50th. Humanity's gift was not ancient knowledge inherited from a lost empire. It was the speed of revision itself, the willingness to be wrong and keep moving. The magnitude of it settled over her, quiet and absolute. Eris limped into the chamber, one hand pressed to a shallow gash across their ribs. Blood slicked their knuckles. They looked at the beacon's steady pulse, then at Maia slumped against the console, then at the dark corridor where the entity had been. "It's gone. It's sealed," Ossian corrected, his translated voice carrying a harmonic she had never heard from him before. His scales shifted through silver to a deep blue and back again. The lock held. The prison endures. A long pause. The Tidesong emissary studied her through the water of his encounter suit. "You fired without a firing solution. I fired with the only one that worked." Her voice came out hoarse. The comm crackled. Kethis Vex's voice emerged from the static, stripped of its earlier arrogance. The words came slowly, each one dragged across something raw. "What are you?" Maia opened her mouth. She had no answer. Not one she could give him in a sentence. Not one he could hold with his static, perfected doctrine. The question hung in the dead air of the station, unanswered. And somewhere on the Revenant's vow, a warlord waited for a ghost to explain herself. The water walls shifted from deep contemplation blue to a warmer ceremonial green the moment the recording began. Ossian watched the color ripple outward from his own position at the center of the meeting chamber, his encounter suit responding to internal state in ways he had long ago trained himself to mask. Not today. Today, he let the light show what it would. The formal armistice recording required a voice, and by Tidesong protocol that voice belonged to the senior emissary present. He began the invocation with the traditional cadence his people had used for 8,000 years of diplomatic service. "Let the waters witness. Let what is spoken here be carried to every current, to every depth, to every shore. The words are now held. They cannot be taken back." Maia Kade sat in a human-designed chair someone had hauled aboard 3 hours ago. Her posture collapsed in on itself like a spent engine. Her short black hair hung limp. One strand caught behind her ear as though she had tucked it there and forgotten. Her fingers were still. Ossian had never seen them still before. It made her look younger. It made her look hollowed out. Eris Dorn stood near the door, not blocking it, not guarding it, just standing. The scarring across their jaw caught the bioluminescent glow, a pale line on dark skin. They had accepted Ossian's offer of water when they came aboard and drank it without checking for contaminants. A small thing. Ossian understood now how much it meant. Kethis Vex hung suspended in a transparent chamber at the far end of the room. The fluid inside tinted pale amber to suppress his necrotic interface with the undead soldier network. The Morthari warlord no longer wore his ceremonial boneplate. Without it, his gray-blue skin looked exposed, almost fragile, across the long arms that had once tapped impatient commands to a fleet. He did not tap now. His hands floated motionless at his sides. His eyes tracked Maia with something that was not fear and not hatred. Something older. Ossian spoke the first formal article. On this date, by the Tidesong calendar, and by mutual recognition of the parties assembled, hostilities between the Morthari Dominion under warlord Kethis Vex and the human representatives of the scout vessel are concluded. The void beacon designated Threat Entity 1 remains sealed. The water walls pulsed once in acknowledgement, recording the moment into crystalline memory. Warlord Kethis, Ossian continued, you retain status as a living witness. Your authority among the dominions is shattered. I do not say this to wound. I say it because the record must be accurate. Kethis's voice emerged from the chamber's speaker, flattened by the fluid, but still recognizable. I understand. 2 words. No arrogance, no edge. Ossian had negotiated with Morthari warlords before. Never for long, never successfully, but the attempt had been made. They did not say I understand. They said you will comply, or they said nothing and attacked. He filed the observation away and moved to the next article. Maia stirred. She leaned forward in the chair, forearms on her knees, and looked not at Ossian, but at some middle distance between him and the glowing water wall. I need to say something. For the record. Ossian gestured affirmation with a ripple of his left hand. I want it on file that humanity's return is not a conquest, she said. We are not here to take what others built. We are not here to settle old debts or claim abandoned territory. She paused. Her fingers twitched once against her knee, the old habit surfacing and subsiding. We will iterate alongside other species, not above them. The sentence landed with a strange weight in the chamber. Ossian let it breathe. The water walls had stilled their gentle shift, holding the exact shade of Maia's voice and the crystalline lattice. She had spoken those words like a promise made to herself before it was made to anyone else. A human thing. He was beginning to recognize them. The record will hold it, Ossian said. Kethis moved inside the suspension chamber. Not a struggle. The fluid permitted only slow, deliberate motion, but a repositioning. He brought one hand up and pressed the palm against the transparent wall. The gesture was unnervingly close to the one Maia had described making in the beacon chamber, her hand against the console as the entity screamed. How? Kethis said. The word hung there. How do you learn so fast? He did not inflect it as a question. He said it the way a Morthari admitted a weakness, which meant he was doing something no Morthari warlord had done in living memory. Our formations were perfect. Centuries of refinement. Every assault pattern optimized by 10,000 generations of deathkin. You saw them once. Once. And you broke them. Maia lifted her head. Her expression did not shift. She looked at Kethis the way she might look at a difficult translation. Something worth understanding, but not something she feared. We fail better than anyone. 7 words. 1 beat of silence. The water walls rippled silver. Ossian felt something shift in his own chest. Not a diplomatic reflex. Not the careful neutrality he had worn through every negotiation of his career. This was different. This was direct. He had spent 30 cycles as an emissary and never once felt what he felt now, watching a human woman tell a shattered warlord the truth and watching the warlord absorb it without resistance. Hope. Personal and unguarded hope. His scales flushed warm amber before he could stop them. The beacon, Kethis said. His voice had dropped. It is still active. Ossian turned to the console at his left. The data stream from the void beacon continued to pulse across the display. The familiar spiral architecture, the inward folding signal pattern that Maia had decoded 6 hours and a lifetime ago. It was locked. That was confirmed. The entity remained sealed inside its dimensional cage, and the psionic interface sat dormant on the station. No mind foolish enough to don it again. But there was something else. Ossian leaned closer. The water in his suit stirred with the movement. There is a secondary signal, he said. Faint, repetitive. It is broadcasting not to the entity but outward, along a vector I do not recognize. Maia rose. The exhaustion fell away from her like a shed skin, replaced by the sharp-edged focus Ossian had witnessed in the beacon chamber. She crossed to the console and stood beside him, close, but not crowding. Human proximity without threat. Another thing he was learning. Show me the pattern, she said. Ossian expanded the signal. It was not language. It was not code. It was simpler than either. A sequence of pulses, mathematical in structure, repeating at intervals calibrated to suggest intelligence rather than natural emission. The pattern varied slightly with each iteration, and Ossian realized with a chill that the variation was not noise. It was refinement. The beacon has been pinging for millennia, Maia said. Her voice had gone quiet, not fearful, reverent. The ancients built it to lock the entity away, but they also built it to call outward. A distress signal, a warning, maybe both. She traced the pattern with one finger, hovering above the console without touching it. And someone just answered. The water walls dimmed. The Tidesong vessel's ambient systems registered the shift in Ossian's emotional state and responded before his conscious mind could issue the override. He did not bother correcting them. There are more prisons, he said, scattered across the galaxy, all listening. Maia nodded. The entity wasn't unique. The ancients fought these things everywhere they found them, and they locked them away, and they built beacons to watch the locks. She turned to face him. Her eyes were bright, with something Ossian could not name. The listeners, whoever they are, they've been hearing the pings for thousands of years. They just didn't know what they were. Or they were afraid to answer. Or they were waiting. For what? For someone to open the door and survive. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of implications, stacked like pressure ridges in deep water. Eris moved for the first time since the recording began. They walked across the chamber, not to the door, not to Maia, but to the suspension chamber where Kethis hung suspended in amber fluid. The Morthari warlord watched them approach, and Ossian saw his fingers curl slightly against the transparent wall, an old reflex. Expectation of threat. Eris stopped. They looked at the control panel set into the base of the chamber, studied it for a long moment, and then reached out and touched it. Not a command, not an adjustment. A single, deliberate press of their palm against the casing, right where the bioluminescent strip pulsed in time with Kethis's suppressed vital signs. The gesture was unmistakable, even to Ossian, who did not share human body language, even to Kethis, who had never been offered respect by an enemy. The Morthari's hand, pressed against the inside of the glass, opened, palm to palm through transparent barrier. Kethis said nothing. Nothing needed saying. Eris stepped back and returned to their position near the door. Their face betrayed nothing. But Ossian had seen. He turned to the console and began to draft the proposal. The words came more easily than he expected. Perhaps because the evidence was overwhelming. Perhaps because he no longer needed to reach for diplomatic neutrality. The truth would serve better. He addressed the Galactic Council and recommended human reintegration under a new designation, adaptive partners. He noted that resistance would be significant, that the Thorax military bloc would object on grounds of territorial precedent, that the Selenith would likely abstain out of indifference, that the Morthari dominions themselves were now fractured and leaderless and would need to be managed with care. But he also noted that humanity had sealed a void devourer in under 8 hours using incremental tactical revision, that they had done it in cooperation with a Tidesong emissary, that they had offered terms to a defeated enemy and left him alive to witness, that their core advantage was not technology or numbers or ancient knowledge. It was the speed with which they converted failure into understanding. The beacon's console chimed. Not an alarm, a notification. The signal pattern had cycled again, And this time, the variation resolved into something legible. Mathematical pulses arranged in a sequence any spacefaring species would recognize. A question. Who are you? Ossian stopped drafting. Maia was already moving toward the reply key, her hand hovering over the console, her fingers beginning to drum again. The water walls behind her had shifted to a color Ossian had never seen them produce. Not blue, not green, not amber, but something bright and unresolved. Maia, he said. She looked back at him. If you answer that, he said, you will be speaking for more than your species. You will be speaking for everyone who has ever lived in the shadow of these things. Everyone who locked them away and died hoping someone would finish the work. Everyone who heard the pings and was too afraid to reply. She met his eyes. The exhaustion was still there beneath the surface, the hollowed-out quality he had noticed when she first sat down. But something else had joined it now. Certainty, perhaps, or perhaps the decision to act despite uncertainty, which Ossian was beginning to suspect was the truest human trait of all. I know, Maia said. Her fingers came down on the key.